Hi, everybody, and good evening. It's my privilege to welcome you all to today's session on theory, practice, and sustainability, understanding multiple perspectives on norm change. This event is hosted by the South Asia Social Norms Learning Collaborative. My name is Rangoli Gupta, and I work at the Center for Social and Behavior Change at Ashoka University. And I co-lead this initiative with Sushmita Mukherjee from Project Concern International. Before we get into today's session, I'd like to encourage everyone to ask questions by putting them in the chat. We've set aside time at the end for panelists to address them. And we have a great lineup of speakers for today, and I think everyone stands to benefit from an engaged conversation. I'd now like to invite Indrajit Chaudhary, Country Director of PCI India, to set the stage for the discussion. Over to you, Indrajit.
Hi, Rangoli.
Yeah, Indrajit, over to you.
Yeah. So, thanks, Rangoli, and thanks all the participants for joining this. I'll just say a few words and then probably hand it over to our great panelists for the discussion. So, few things just to say about social norm, particularly social norm is all pervasive. So it is all over there in our life, and it is affecting our life every day. And in our program context also, and specifically in the behavior change domain, all the practitioners and researchers who work in the behavior change domain are facing that on a regular basis, facing and trying to understand that, trying to work on that on a everyday basis. But at the same time, this area is not really the well researched. There a lot of research is going on, a lot of work is going on in this. So it made us the requirement of creating this kind of a learning collaborative. So a global learning collaborative first was being created by Georgetown University around 4 or 5 years back, and but the understanding was that the norms specifically change in different geographies. So it was important that different geographies create their learning collaborative. So we created this South Asia Social Norm Learning Collaborative in January 2021, and with the support of Georgetown University. So it is PCI and CSBC, with the support and guidance from Georgetown University, created this social norm learning collaborative for South Asia. So we are almost 1.5 years. In this 1.5 years, we have hosted at least 4 webinars. It's the 5th webinar that's happening. Around 350 individual members are part of this part of the learning collaborative, and around 200 organizations are also organization member of it. So and we, other than these webinars, we had also conducted 3 workshops specifically with the people who want to learn more on specific areas like implementing social norm, understanding the nuances of social norm. There was a workshop. One workshop happened on the measurement aspect. Another workshop happened specifically on the research around social norm. So this learning collaborative is doing a few initiatives, but one important thing that came into our mind while we are doing all these different workshops, most of these workshops and also the webinars were happening primarily on one specific topic. Either it is implementation, also we bring in few implementers who are doing social norm work, or it was happening on research, trying to get the perspective of the researchers or around social norm and what they think specifically for South Asia, what kind of work needs to happen. But at the and also we had donors representative in many of these webinars anyway. But we thought that it is important that we hear all the three perspectives of the three kinds of practitioner, the three kinds of kinds of specialists. One is a practitioner, one is researcher, one is a donor side, so that we have a very open conversation around the lenses they use to understand this area, the lenses they use to implement work, to work around social norm, and also the lenses that donors use specifically for investing on social norms. So I think it was feeling important. So we actually wanted to convene a webinar where representatives from all three domains are there. So we are very happy to have Dr. Sana from Ashoka University, who is a senior researcher there. We have Nayan. Nayan heads the Japaigo Momentum, who are doing a lot of work in and around social norm. And Shekhar, our great friend, Shekhar was earlier also part of another webinar. And Shekhar is from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He's also having a lot of rich experience around in social norm area. Other than being a donor, he's also a subject specialist in that. So I'm very happy to welcome all three of you, and thanks to all the participants for joining.
Thanks, Indrajit. That was a great context, and we are really happy to have three subject matter experts here wearing different hats. I know they are able to wear different hats at the same time, but we would request them to one hat based questions today. And I'm glad that it's a huge attention towards social norms is given. We are here to understand and recognize the influence of social norms, as we are all making different efforts to advance gender equality. As Indrajit mentioned, we will start with the question putting to the researcher, and for that, I would love to introduce Dr. Sana. So Dr. Sana Palsule is a senior research specialist at CSBC Ashoka University. She is a behavioral scientist interested in the dynamics of behavior change and mechanisms that link intrinsic and psychological traits. So Dr. Sana, without wasting much time, let me start by putting a question to you so that we can trigger today's discussion. From your research experiences, could you just give us the insights like how individual attitudes and personas often clash with social norms? So how, from your research experience, would you like to share us that how researchers navigate this tension? Over to you.
Thanks, Sushmita. No, it's a great question, and I'm going to start with an example to illustrate. So I'm just going to share my screen. Is that visible? Great.
Yes.
So this is an example that we're all kind of unfortunately well acquainted with, right? Which is social distancing. So social distancing was brought in across the world to limit the transmission of COVID. And at the peak of the pandemic, social distancing was this new social norm, right, at a global scale. It prescribed a very limited range of kind of appropriate behaviors, and it created very clear expectations of how we should behave in public and private settings. Now, for researchers like myself who are interested in individual differences and behavior, this new norm was also a unique kind of research opportunity, because we could actually examine kind of the influence of individual factors like personality and how they interact with these social norms, and specifically adherence and deviance to social norms, which recent research has started to kind of look into. Before we delve into the research itself, and I think that'll just illustrate kind of that tension between individual factors and social norms, I just want to spend a couple of minutes understanding what kind of personality scientists like myself think of when we talk about personality. So when we're talking about personality and these individual factors, we're talking about these 5 personality traits, and many of you will already be familiar with them. So researchers over the last 4 decades have understood kind of differences between people based on these 5 key traits. We remember them as the big 5, or the acronym OCEAN, for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Now, each of these big 5 traits has a very strong explanatory power, and decades of research have found that they predict a range of behaviors as well as life outcomes. What's particularly interesting about the Big Five in relation to social norms is that they allow us to make predictions about how people actually adhere or deviate to social norms based on their level of personality. So I'm going to give you a very brief snapshot of these predictions with each of the Big Five. So the first trait we can look at, for example, is openness, right? So openness reflects this tendency to think in abstract, complex ways. People high in openness tend to be quite adventurous, while those on the opposite end of the spectrum are more practical and conventional. Now, when it comes to social norms, openness allows us to make a number of predictions. So, for example, the curiosity of more open individuals can manifest in a less kind of cautious attitude towards novelty, such as a novel virus, which therefore sees these individuals kind of more likely to put themselves at an elevated risk. On the other hand, openness to experience is also associated with more accurate risk perception, which could be an enabling factor of kind of good health behaviors. We can also look at conscientiousness, and conscientiousness is particularly relevant when it comes to social distancing and preventative behaviors. Conscientiousness, as we know, is this tendency to be kind of habitually careful, reliable. A conscientious person will control, regulate, and direct their impulses. So they're likely to be kind of the early adopters of mask wearing, even without kind of guidance to do so. Extroversion is a very interesting one. I think when we typically think of extroversion, the common kind of layperson view is that it's related to shyness. But extroversion is actually made up of two facets in personality science. One is assertiveness, so that kind of comfort in the spotlight, and the other is sociability, having close social bonds and being at kind of in the center of the central node in a social network, which is the reason that social distancing was particularly difficult for extroverts. Agreeableness, of all the traits, I think agreeableness reflects that adherence to social norms the most. It's a tendency to kind of be courteous, helpful, trusting. And then finally, we have neuroticism. Neuroticism is characterized by impulsivity and a tendency to experience kind of negative emotions, such as anxiety, worry, fear, and self-consciousness. And although neuroticism is generally associated with kind of poor mental and physical health, people who score higher neuroticism tend to be more fearful of danger and kind of danger cues, and so engage in more kind of hygienic germ avoidance behavior. Now, in the last couple of years, personality researchers like myself have delved into the impact of personality in relation to social norms. And there was a study that looked at 100,000 participants between 2020 and 21 and examined their Big Five personality traits in relation to attitudes and behavior around COVID social norms. And as expected, kind of even when controlling for demographic factors, personality is a powerful predictor when it comes to adherence to social norms. So specifically, people who are more agreeable, conscientious, open, and neurotic were all much more likely to stay at home and follow kind of social distancing guidelines. The exception here was extroverts. And again, that can be explained by that kind of sociability facet, right? Social distancing denies the behavioral freedoms that extroverts are used to, which is why they may be more likely to kind of break the rules. Openness to experience was an interesting one because that was the strongest predictor of adherence to norms. And one explanation for this, there have been a couple of explanations for this, but one is that open individuals are ideologically kind of tend to be left-wing. And recent evidence shows that kind of during the pandemic, liberals were disproportionately more likely to comply with social distancing guidelines. And there have been a number of kind of explanations that have been put forward here. But what I would suggest is when we're thinking about individual factors and we're looking at the impact of, for example, personality and social norms, we also can't ignore the role of the situation and the environment. And in this study, it wasn't just personality that kind of determined adherence to social norms. The study also looked at the impact and the moderating role of the stringency of the policy, of policies around kind of social distancing. And specifically, kind of the stricter the policies, the less room there was for personality to impact kind of social distancing behavior. And we saw this when it came to openness to experience and neuroticism. It weakened the effects of those traits in terms of their impact on likelihood of social distancing. That aside, even when you account for context and environment, personality is still relevant. And in this case, people's behavior around social norms was still linked to their base personality traits, how agreeable they are, how conscientious they are, and how extroverted as well. So I think a takeaway here would be, we need to take this interactionist position and look at that dual influence of both the environment and the individual. Now, the pandemic was, I'll just briefly talk about that's one example of how we kind of look at individual factors in relation to social norms. It was a very unique circumstance, but when we look at the big 5 traits and personality, we can also look at other contexts and how they play out in relation to social norms. And another context that's particularly prevalent is the workplace. Right? We can look at deviance to social norms in the workplace in terms of kind of violating organizational norms or being what we call interpersonally deviant, so challenging authority. And there again, we see some patterns emerge with relation to personality. Extroversion is associated with more kind of interpersonal deviance because of these characteristics of kind of assertiveness and risk-taking, while conscientiousness is less likely to be associated with deviance of any kind. And the organization is a nice kind of segue into a brief kind of second example that I want to just quickly touch upon that illustrates the complexity of examining personality and individual factors in relation to social norms. So the image on the left is this classic, within social psychology, this classic kind of prevalent norm of extroversion in our organizations. So for decades in Western contexts, extroversion has been kind of normatively valued. It's been revered, and particularly in industries such as banking and consultancy. And we see this play out in organizations in terms of leadership promotion and leadership emergence. And we see that with the table on the right, that as you move up an organizational hierarchy, an organization is more likely to be made up of extroverts. However, what personality scientists have found, and this is the important kind of nuance that I want to emphasize today, is that people can change. We can change our personality to fit a social role, a context, or a social norm. So an introvert can act extroverted to fit the extroverted culture of their organization. And it's important to recognize this because we typically think of individual attitudes and personality traits as fixed, right, and static, whereas these traits are actually, more kind of malleable than we think they are. And in the same way that social norms can shift, and I know we've covered that in previous sessions, so can personality. And that's why it's so important to look at individual factors in that kind of ecosystem. So just to the question of how do researchers actually navigate, the role and the interaction between individual factors and social norms. So there are 3 kind of takeaways that I'd like to kind of outline. And of course, we can get more into this in the Q&A. I think the first is we need to simply kind of build an awareness that individual factors such as personality traits do play a role in response to social norms. And surprisingly, very little research has actually delved into the role of individual factors and in personality, particularly in the social sector, which also makes kind of seminars like this even more kind of important. Personality traits have high predictive power, and so we need to kind of take those into account. And if we go back to that earlier example of the pandemic and social distancing, if governments and healthcare leaders, when they were coming up with the messaging, if they could take into account that it's not just specific, that we can actually look at specific behaviors that influence how we comply or deviate from social norms, that would have been very useful. So for example, when it comes to messaging and communication for extroverts, right? It could have been more useful for governments to message, we hear you, we see that, you miss social interaction, you miss your friends, but you need to comply. So more kind of tailored messaging based on individual factors. The second takeaway, I think, is just to account for the interaction, as I mentioned, between personality and environmental influences and social influences. So it's not just that personality shapes our response to social norms, it's also that personality is in part shaped by social norms, right? Because personality is malleable. And finally, recognizing that in the same way that social norms can change and can shift, so can personality. So when we're thinking about interventions to change and to shift social norms, can we also think about supporting personality change and changing, a focus on changing personality? So I'll just pause here, and looking forward to kind of taking more questions in the Q&A.
Thank you, Sana. I think that was brilliant, talking about the personality traits. And that actually helps me to move to our next subject matter expert. And I will request Nayan to help us out to understand more from the practitioner's head. Let me welcome Nayan. Nayan is the chief of party with USAID's Momentum Country Global Leadership, India Yash, which is being led by Japaigo globally. And Nayan, as a practitioner, we just heard from a researcher, like, there's a purist kind of, but as practitioner on ground, then you are among the public and a lot of personalities, a lot of challenges, complex societal structures. So my question to you, Nayan, would be that, what are some of the common challenges you have come across in going from theory to practice and at scale? And just substantiate with some of the insights from your work that you have done on ground as well. So over to you then.
Thanks, Sushmita. Thanks for having me here. So just very briefly about the program that I'm leading. And so this is Momentum Country and Global Leadership, India Yash. It's a USAID supported program. And this is a global program which Japaigo is leading. It's part of the consortium. So the age group that we focus at is 10 to 19 years. And this program is particularly looking at the sexual and reproductive health. So as part of this program, we have 14 different interventions. 2 of them are providing technical assistance to the ministry. I'm not getting into the details of it, but 2 of the interventions which are, so one of them is child early and forced marriage, and the second one is gender-based violence. So these are the 2 interventions where we are looking at social norm programming in a big way. So very quickly about the CFM, which is child early and forced marriage. So this is, we are looking in the state of Jharkhand and Odisha. And so the whole idea is, how do you keep girls at school so that the early cases of marriages can be avoided, and also working with the faith-based leaders. So a lot of work involves, social norm programming. And the other intervention very quickly, which is the gender-based violence, where we are working in the state of Assam across 11 districts, where we are working in a multi-sectoral partnership with the Department of Police, social welfare, education. So that's one part of it, to run special interventions, which is part of the police station. And also we have a community arm where we are working more closely with the community, so that the gender-based violence can be identified and addressed right there at the community level. So these 2 interventions does involve a lot of social norm programming. Now coming to your question, Sushmita. So if you look at the challenges, I think that there are 3 key challenges which comes to my mind, when you look at, so the first one is, we know that social norm programming and changes, it takes time. And it's difficult to look for quick results, right? So we know that, especially when we are working in a project framework, right, where it's time bound, we want to look for quick success. So I think it comes as a challenge to many of the practitioners, and I can see some of the smiling faces here. So it's an acknowledgement to the fact that it's actually very difficult to see change in short period of time. And this is also important to note that the trajectory to social norm change is, it's not linear. And so there may be little change for a long time. But when enough people believe that enough people have changed, then the shift can happen very quickly. So that's the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about the key challenge. The second one is the importance of context. So we know that a lot of the evidence still comes from the West. So there are new evidences which are coming up in India. But again, unlike in other domain where you have evidence coming in and you can very quickly, that it is, the evidence is, it has a lot of generalizability, right? And you can generalize those evidences. But when it comes to social norm programming, every site doesn't fit everywhere, right? So you have to look for very specific intervention. So it's also important for us. And so this has been one of our challenge, and the way we have tried to address this challenge is to undertake the approach, which is the CLA approach, continuous learning and adaptation approach. And so that has been one of the this challenge. The third, and which is an important aspect, which is because sustainability is such a big important issue. But when you look at social norm programming, so most of the time, because we all want to be successful, right? So there is a strong tendency to put in a lot of resources and to make that program a real success. But we tend to forget is so this problem is quite across the board. And so when you come up with a program which is very, very resource intensive, so it reduces the chance of replicability, reduces the chance of taking it to other places. So that looks to me as one of the key challenge when you're looking at sustainability. And so here, I think we have to understand sustainability when you're looking at social norm programming in a little different way. So here, the approach that's coming from the program, here the sustainability is not in terms of someone else taking up that role in future. But can we shift the gear? Can we pass on the learning that we have to the community, where the community takes the ownership of it, and the changes that we want to see, it is much more organic. So I think that's one of the way to navigate the challenge. Back to you, Sushmita. Thanks.
Thanks, Nayan. I think very important, and for all of us who are really ambitious to work on scale, to really ponder that how do we do it, the timelines and everything. Maybe a follow-up quick question to you, that as per your insights, how do you gauge that tipping point where you feel, okay, now this is the time when social norm shifting can be self-propagating? Could you just throw your insights on that?
Thanks, Sushmita. I think that's a great question, and there could be multiple answers to it. So I think to me, when the action is triggered organically by an individual or it's by a community, so that's the tipping point, I would say. So the efforts to change social norms are more effective. We know that when it is when the programming provides alternate behavior or the desired behavior for people to take actions. So some of the pointers that we can definitely think about when we are looking at the tipping point. So the first one is the stickiness factor. I think that comes to my mind. And so what do I mean when I say stickiness? It's like, so we run program, but what is the level of intention, the retention with the target audience that we are talking about? So I think that's one of the important aspects of all programming, all social norm programming, to look into it. I'll give an example here. So one of the programs that we're looking forward is the youth-led movement. And here, what is the focus is to actually look forward for a program which is youth-led in true sense, right? So we have been thinking about youth programming, but we have looked at youth more as subjects, right? Where engagement of the youth has been looked at as the end in itself, but been designed by people, those who are not in that age group, let us say, those who are not young. So how do you run actually a campaign which is truly youth-led, right? So to run that kind of, so there has to be a shift in kind of the ownership, right? Where the ownership is back to the young people and they can take it forward. So that's the second thing I think, which is important to understand, that when there is a shift in gear from the program team to the community when they are taking ownership of it. So that's one of the tipping point for me. The third, which comes to my mind, is definitely there is a shift in the positive behavior. And if the shift is happening much more organically without external push. So external push is the program itself is an external push, right? So we are having resources, we are having trained human manpower, and there are nudges which are coming externally. If that is much more organic, where the shift in behavior is actually being displayed by the community or some from the community, so that itself can be a tipping point. Another point which comes to my mind is, I think all great programs which are really organic, right? So it attracts allies, it attracts partnerships. So that also could be another way to understand if the programming is actually reaching to the tipping point. Last but not the least, it's important to see that any successful program would involve more number of role models, more number of the resource group that's coming up from the community. So if these are, so this could be some of the pointers. I'm sure that there are many, and so that I'm sure that many of us sitting here would say that these are the good indicators or good to tell us that we are reaching the tipping point. But I'll stop there. Back to you, Sushmita. Thanks.
Thanks, Nayan. And I think social norms change at scale, advancing gender equality, all three is a complex combination, and we all are looking forward to bring some time-bound solutions to see if something works and has a sustainability angle here. Hence, I would like to switch to Shekhar. Shekhar is a subject matter expert on social norms, and he is also wearing the being a resource provider, a donor's hat today. So, and let me welcome Shekhar first. And so Shekhar is a senior program officer, behavioral insights at the country office, India country office of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And his works include understanding drivers of health-seeking behaviors and influencing policy and programming to address those. Of course, it's a long introduction, but I would like to jump to the question to Shekhar. So Shekhar, maybe my question to you is that how do you gauge the efficacy of a research project or intervention, and whether or not it should be continued, given that norm change is a time-consuming process? So how do you make this connections, and how do you take a call, or what are your insights there?
First of all, thanks for having me, Sushmita and the team. Secondly, I'll be disregarding your first suggestion of wearing a donor's hat. I will first wear a practitioner's hat and then go to a donor hat. In the sense that I would first contest the notion that norm change is time-consuming, right? Not all norm change is time-consuming. We need to consider the fact that we can't have.
Shekhar, your voice is cutting actually. Could you then take off your phone or some headphones then?
Is this better?
Yeah, it is better now.
Okay. Yeah. I don't know how much you heard. I will just say, I was just saying that I will first not wear my donor's hat. I will wear my practitioner's hat and then go to the donor hat. Is it still?
Let's try this. It's better now.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I would contest that the norm change is a time-consuming process as a blanket statement, right? Because there are certain norm changes which is much faster than others. Like, let's take an example, right? One, we should have a theory of change that connects norm change to actual behavior change, which is where our outcomes are at. So we will need to track outcomes at a behavior level. Dr. Sana spoke about tracking behaviors, right? Now, this change, theory of change about behaviors should be ideally based on some model of behavior change, whether it's COMB, FOG model, whatever, ideally some well-accepted model. All of them typically tend to have the motivation factor, M factor, as one key component. And most of the norms change work tend to be focused on that. But what we have seen is that a lot of norms change work, which impacts ability, opportunity, can be much faster. Let me take an example. Right? On family planning work in sub-Saharan Africa, we see that people were motivated to use the contraceptives, and that motivation increased with intervention, but ability to negotiate for contraceptive use didn't really change. But there were other interventions that impacted that ability, which moved the needle much faster. And I still see that people are not able to hear me. Now, I just shifted houses to Kerala, which is God's own country, but really with the devil's own networking. But yeah, so hopefully you can hear some bit of what I'm speaking.
Yeah, can you be just a little closer to your microphone? I think this
I am literally inside my laptop, so I can't really get better closer than this.
Thank you.
So, essentially, first part is that when you have norm change program that touch ability, opportunity factors of behavior change, that can be lead to faster sort of reads of changing norms, right? Which mean that we'll get faster inputs and we can gauge better and faster how things are moving. Second, a lot of our focus of norm change, especially when you look at large program, is not about change. Some of it is changing large norms at a gross population level, but a lot of it is activating the right norm with the right context. I know Nayan spoke about the importance of context, right? And the easiest example to relate to is, littering behavior inside metro stations versus outside. People literally carry the trash outside the metro station, walk out and throw it away. Right? The norm shift immediately once you're inside, and norm shift when you're outside. That's the importance of context and cues. So a lot of our work has to be on activating the right kind of norms, not necessarily changing norms. There are definitely areas where you need to change norms at a population level, but a lot of work can be at activating norms in different contexts. How do you signal that it's easier, better, acceptable to report gender-based violence at a police station? Right. So that's one in a sense that our focus on changing norms, moving to actually activating norms, can also mean faster in terms of giving us reads on what's working or not. Lastly, motivation is still one of the biggest factor in where norms change play, and therefore we need to understand how do we get better, quicker feedback loops. So I'll take an example of gender-based violence work in Nigeria, where there was a norm change work trying to understand how do you reduce gender-based violence, which actually, the publication is just out, I think, actually showed that the severe blowback to the interventions triggered male masculinity norms and increased gender-based violence. So in a lot of these norm change work, the negative externalities tend to creep up faster than the positive change that Nayan spoke about. It's not really linear with the positive change, but the negative externalities are faster. So it might be able to say, in the absence of negative externalities, it might be okay for us to continue programming and continue work on it. That's another way of sort of getting some feedback loops in. So with all of these, I would say, we can be much faster and effective at understanding what's working, what's not working. But there's no replacement to patience in norms work. We know that decades of work, and we know that it does take time, and donor patience is important to give people the time and space to do deep work. Norm change is not really as simple as nudges in typical behavioral economic terms, right? Which are much more simpler to do, right? Therefore, there's no shortcutting that. And it's a long-winded, part donor answer, but more practitioner answer. But hopefully that will work.
No, I think we are glad. It depends on how do you see, what's your lens, and how do you want the practitioners and the researchers to look into. That was really great. I would like to throw one question, maybe open to Dr. Sana and Nayan both, and maybe Sana, you can go first to respond here. Is that we heard researchers, practitioners, and donors now, and it is very essential in the norm shift interventions, the three departments or the three buckets to connect with each other and talk to each other. So my question is that how do we make the feedback loop, that Shekhar was just now referring, feedback loop between practice and the researchers, the design more responsive, connected. How do you see that you have been doing? Any sort of insights of success, failures that you would like to share?
Thanks, Sushmita. So I think, and I think Shekhar has already kind of mentioned this in terms of kind of how do we bring those theory of change together, right? In terms of behavior change as well as norm change. And I think building on that, I think what works well is just a much more systematic knowledge kind of sharing and systemization kind of process. So, from a research side, how do we build a robust kind of knowledge base where we have, the clear kind of frameworks that we typically use. Shekhar also mentioned kind of the COMBI model. There are a number of different kind of models of behavior change that we use. And how do we kind of structure that with the typical outputs and the typical outcomes of these frameworks? So I think it's a short answer, but in terms, I think it's really about kind of that knowledge structure and knowledge sharing as well to bridge that gap.
Thanks. Nayan, what do you think of feedback loop between the practice, research, intervention, scale?
So Sushmita, I'll give an example from my life. So 10 years I was in program initially. I worked with CARE, UNICEF, the initial 10 years of my career. Then 6 years, I was full-time being an academician. So I was an associate professor. And then again, I came back to program, right? So I like that journey. I like that transition from academics to program and program to academics. But what I realized is, and I think this is more, I get to see more in South Asia. You don't get to see more in Europe and in US, where if you are in academics, it doesn't mean that you have to be away from practice. And if you are in practice, doesn't mean that you have to be away from, the academics. So that transition happens more frequently as we don't get to see that transition happening more in India and South Asian countries. I think the more, as long as we are able to hear practitioners inside the classroom, because what the practitioners would do is they will actually ask you questions which are relevant in the ground. And from the academics or the researchers, so they bring in the rigor. So, and I think it's not either of, it's one contributes to the other one, right? And more the transition and the shift that happens, so the better it is in terms of, bringing it together. Yeah. Back to you, Sushmita.
Yeah, thank you. Shekhar, any more thoughts? Your thoughts?
And I earlier said that, the donors have little to offer rather than patience in this space. But I would nuance it there as well, right? One aspect that donors have is because of the decision-making process to fund certain things, you tend to have views on what's happening and the interlocking pieces that are available, that are ongoing on the ground. And some of those interlocking pieces have real good value to cross collaborate, cross learn from each other. For instance, we've been leveraging certain ongoing concurrent monitoring programs for various other, for other programs which it was not initially designed for. Just because the ability to see that, okay, there are these moving pieces, but also there are these moving research pieces that is also happening in the same geography or similar areas and themes of inquiry. So I feel like donors do have a role to at least surface some of those interlocking pieces, be a channel to back to research and back to academia, back to knowledge strengthening, to say that these can be leveraged for either your research purpose or sharing learning across programs. And finally, patience as well, right? So that's my answer to, how do you make feedback look better, etc. It's definitely a motherhood and apple pie kind of statement. So, but it's not wrong, right? We have to be flexible on our theory of change. We have to be flexible on our tools and flexible on our feedback mechanisms and flexible in our ability to collaborate with each other.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. We've got a good amount of questions and quite, good questions from our audience. While I am posing it, I would also request panelists to also check the questions on the chat. And I'm just putting some questions to begin with, and you can also feel free to choose a question that you would like to answer. Maybe Sana, if I can come again back to you to pose my first audience question. I think I'm picking one. There are many questions particularly referred to you. Can a person's core personality or behavior be changed through interventions? The core personality and behaviors. What does your research insights tell us?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And in fact, so it's only in the last decade that, and I would say really in the last 5 years, that researchers have really delved into personality change. And when we talk about core personality, we're talking about those traits. And the simple answer is yes, a person's core personality can change. And in the last couple of years, particularly, researchers have actually started developing, digital interventions for personality change that actually can impact, we've looked at conscientiousness and we've also looked at neuroticism, can actually increase an individual's conscientiousness, decrease an individual's neuroticism. And typically these kind of interventions use kind of a combination. So these digital interventions use a combination of kind of gamification as well as kind of principles of habit building and goal setting. And then using those kind of principles combined with, for example, a smartphone app and the gamification aspect, people's personality traits can shift over time.
Great, thanks. I'm sure there are a lot of follow-up questions to that, but then there are a couple of questions for you, but let me just pick one for you. Is that, can you give an example of component of stickiness as a principle or strategy other in your work, like, or in general, like, other than anecdotal evidence as the question has been posed?
Thanks, Sushmita. So I think that's a great question. So in terms of stickiness, of course, I mean, MCGL India, yes, so we are still a new program. We're not reached to that stage. But I can kind of, think about some of the examples. So for example, if you are working with a community and, so there are interventions where you are looking for the recall and you are reaching out to the community and asking something, and then you realize that, okay, there was an intervention which was there in the past, and there are, factors which are coming in from that intervention, right? And stickiness is also important in terms of when you are looking forward to take the community as an ownership, right? So it's linked actually when you are thinking about ownership from the community, or you want it to be actually organic, right? You want that information to stay with the community. And that's how you start finding, new role models. You start finding new references group coming up. Back to you.
Great,
Thanks.
thank you. Yeah, of course, in the social norm sector, we see that, there has been so many of interventions in the child marriage thing, but still it's not getting zero. The decline is not that paced up, so many interventions. So I think there's also some bit of stickiness is on our face. Yes, Indrajit, please.
No, I just thought to respond to this particular question. Yes, I think there are lots of programs which has shown stickiness. Particularly, it is difficult to answer because most of the program it's not captured in all programs, because most of the program stops in the baseline and end line, and after that it is never measured. But one program that did it was Prachar. So in Prachar, there were follow-up interviews like after 5 years, so second phase, third phase of interviews. And we really found stickiness among behaviors, and very, very, very difficult behaviors of very normative behaviors related to SRH. And we found stickiness, and we found that probably all those adolescents who went through the Prachar program as adolescent group during that time were more probable to use contraception method, you have higher spacing, etc. after they are married. So stickiness, yes, there are programs which can actually show stickiness. Thanks.
Yeah, very brilliant. I have another question for Nayan, but maybe Shekhar, if I can pose the next question first to you. One of the participants wants to understand, what would your audit system look like at each stage of intervention? How do you monitor the efficacy of social programming in the journey from intent to implementation? Because, these are all, the social norm change is a very different kind of measurement is needed here.
I think first is the realization that we are working in a complex dynamic space, right? Therefore, it's pretty much unreasonable to completely design everything upfront. To completely design, okay, at each stage of intervention, here are my inputs, here are my outputs, here's what should happen. Theory of change at a top level will guide you, but then at each stage, it would go undergo refinement. We would have feedback loops to say, okay, this was your initial hypothesis, and which led to a theory of change of, okay, if you do this, you will get these kind of outputs, which will lead to this kind of outcomes. Now, therefore, I really don't want to answer this question of what would audit system look like at each stage of intervention, but to say that you will have a theory of change. You would ideally put a measurement and evaluation program that aligns upfront. but then have very quick feedback loops at every stage to say, is it tracking well, and change the measurement and learning evaluation. But therefore, it does not really give you good baseline and line numbers, but these are responsive loops that are better in terms of giving you better feedback rather than a really crisp baseline and endline result that you can report out. It's an issue that the social sector has to it will have to grapple, because we are necessarily playing in that complex space.
Yeah, thank you. Nayan, can I come back to you? So when we are on ground, there are multiple stakeholders, multiple factors that one needs to be taking care of in the norm shifting interventions. So there's one question, I'm just slightly expanding that question, that in changing norms, where do you find the participant has written police, but I think I would like to twist it to the system. Like, how do you engage with the system? And there are different kinds of systems, judiciary, executive, and all those things. How do you engage with them? And sometimes people only have community-based interventions. Sometimes in the social ecological model, they have interventions across all the concentric circles. So where do you see and how do you see that? And at scale, of course.
That's a great question, Sushmita. And so here in this case, what we are thinking about is to have an intervention where we can improve the sensitivity, the sensitiveness of the service provider. And so there are a lot of examples, and we know that one example is the virtual reality, right? So when you have those virtual reality, if you can bring it to the service provider, right? It's like living and understanding life from the other's perspective. To give an example, so even people, those who are differently abled, they also have SRH needs, right? But how it is, and to actually visualize it, it's very difficult for a service provider who is not differently abled. So for example, someone who is say visually impaired, right? So they do have sexual needs. They do have the SRH rights, right? But how actually it is a life of a blind person. So that is something which is very difficult to comprehend from a service provider perspective, right? And so that kind of visual reality, and there are so many ways to do it, right? So if you are able to bring that visual reality and let that participant, so here the service provider is the participant, to go through that and start appreciating. So once we know that, and there are a lot of evidence which are there, that when they go through those processes, it actually improves their sensitivity towards the service provider or their sensitivity towards the target audience.
Great. I think there is a lot of trust on how you are designing it, how you are considering and putting together all your factors, stakeholders, and contextual, elements and the stakeholders. They are very essential when we are designing any norm shifting, and especially when you are bringing in the lens of gender equality ambitions there. Just checking, Sana, Shekhar, Nayan, did you manage to go through the chat questions? Is there any favorite question did you pick up that you would love to respond?
Couple of them, I think there was a question on motivation not being there in what Sana spoke about, but each of us bring a different perspective, right? Sana spoke about personality, and people bring their personality to a situation. You will have either motivation to act or not to act. So there's a lot unsaid in how behavior works, and therefore a lot of it is not explicitly mentioned. So motivation is a factor as much as a factor as personality and the situation, right? The classic text on person and the situation, I forget by who, from 1980s, talk about this issue of personality explains certain variance in behavior. The situation explains a lot of variance in behavior. But these two interact to give you whether you are motivated to act or not. That's how I see the link.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right, Shekhar. I think motivation does fall under this kind of larger umbrella term, right? So I think, Shekhar, maybe you're thinking of Michelle, and Walter Michel had this person, situation, interaction kind of model.
Lee Ross, yeah, not Michelle, but yeah, Lee Ross and Michelle did the collaborative. Anyway.
I think it's around the same time, yeah. So motivation does fall under that umbrella term of person, individual level factors, right? I chose to focus on personality, but we have, motivation, specific kind of belief systems also would fall under that as well. So yeah, that it covers kind of a number of different individual attributes.
Great, thank you. I believe this is very interesting, and we can carry on and continue to with all of you to really pick up your brains on how do you see social norms, and a lot of questions are coming up. I'm a little conscious of time, and before I hand over to my colleague Rangul, you want to say something, Shekhar?
So Shmita, there's a question in Q&A. How do you measure sustainability of a behavior change or a norm change in a given time frame?
Would you like to attempt? Why don't you wear a different hat now?
The sustainability aspect is going to be a really tough question to answer, right? Because as Nayan said, a lot of the measurements end when the program ends. You also spoke about the fact that Indrajit also spoke about the fact that only very few programs, take it beyond the program's life to say whether it's sustainable or not. You don't necessarily track or figure upfront how do these programs transition into beyond certain programs' lives, right? So do you transition to the government system? Do you transition your work and people and resources to social organizations, community organizations, or to the community themselves? Some of these are hairy problems that not a lot of programs think about upfront. But therefore, no real good answer as to how do you ensure sustainability, other than to the fact that we have to think and do in cycles and figure, like Nayan said, how do you get a lot more community ownership is probably an indicator to whether this will sustain itself or not.
Can I add to this?
Yes, please.
So, I think it's a lot depends on what we want to sustain, and that's where the answer would come from. So Shekhar did mention about public, did mention about community. Maybe some of the intervention is best when it is given to the market forces, right, to operate. So bringing in the private, right? So it all depends on what is that we want to sustain and what is the best way to sustain. I think that's where, and a lot of the programming, ideally, this answer should be found right at the beginning of the program. And unfortunately, that's not every time we do it. But I think finding an answer right at the beginning of it, what is that we want to sustain and who are the best and what are the best ways to sustain it? I think that's something which is very crucial. Thanks.
Definitely. Maybe some of the behaviors are very required, desired for a short term. Some of the behaviors should change also to go to more and more positivity, to ideal things. So what is sustainability in what time frame? That's quite a puzzle questions for many of us. And definitely what social norms like suddenly become good, suddenly becomes harmful. We have to constantly keep on evolving, constantly keep on checking that in what context, what is happening and where. Okay, thanks a lot for the brilliant, question answers to me. I think we posed some tough questions to all three of you. That was really great. I would like to hand over now to my colleague Rangoli to give some more information about the platform and closing as well. Over to you, Rangoli.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think we've all experienced the potential and the power of cooperation and community-based change at some point or another. And I think our conversation today has only sort of reinforced that truth. I'd like to thank our panelists for their thoughtful commentary and nuanced analysis of the complexities of norm change, as well as their insights on how we can make evidence-based interventions more robust at all levels. Finally, I'd like to extend my gratitude to our audience for joining us today. It's sessions like these that cement our conviction that these are conversations worth having. And if you would like to be kept apprised of future initiatives hosted by the collaborative, please consider joining the SASNLC. I'll put the link to register in the chat box in a minute. And I hope to see many of you in future sessions. Thank you, and I hope you have a good evening.
Thanks, everybody. And it was brilliantly experience for me as well. Thanks, Sana. Thanks, Nayan, and thanks, Shekhar, and thanks, Indrajit as well. Thanks, Rangoli, and all the other team members who are behind the scenes working to make it successful. Thanks a lot. Have a great day, evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.